Amazon and the northern forests. That increases temperature, which then puts more pressure on other tipping points. But interestingly, some can be related by ocean circulation, this one. So basically what's happening in terms of Greenland, the melting of Greenland ice sheets, putting a pool of cool water there. That's slowing down the North Atlantic circulation. What that's doing is allowing subsurface heat to accumulate here because of the lake. And that is increasing the erosion of the West Antarctic Ocean. So there are connections from the ocean and connections through the atmosphere. So we published a paper last year trying to put all this together in a little synthesis, and we drew this cartoon saying, here's an ice age. It's what we call a stability landscape. You can think of the Earth as a ball rolling around this landscape. So there's an ice age, and there's a Holocene up there, a little stable warm period that sits stable for 10, 15,000 years, and then due to Earth's orbit, it destabilizes and the Earth rolls back into an ice age. It does that every 100,000 years. But we reckon now, I should put up there what that looks like. That's what we're trying to describe there, that sort of graph. But now, that spike at the end, we've now moved out of the Holocene, but not toward an ice age. We moved away from an ice age into some sort of terrain that we don't know very well. We've drawn it just sort of this shallow plain where the Earth is not really going to a new state yet, but it's pretty unstable. But the concern is that this tipping cascade could represent something like a cliff or a waterfall in this landscape, where you go down to an extremely stable state of the Earth system, because we know it's been there before, called hothouse Earth, with little or no polar ice, much higher sea levels, 4 or 5 degree temperature rise. And that's feasible. We know it exists in the past. What we don't know is how close we are to a bifurcation point, where we are committed to going over the cliff. And think of it like a waterfall in a stream. You're committed to going over that waterfall well upstream when you get into a strong current and you can't get out. So that's the question we have to ask ourselves. When do we hit this bifurcation? So what we want to do is get onto this pathway, which is one that requires biosphere stewardship, really tackling the climate change problem. And that's going to require deep transformation of human societies. What if we don't get there? What does hothouse Earth look like? It's hard to say, but here's some guesses by people. Pretty much most of the tropics and subtropics are going to be too hot. We can't really live there. Big changes in temperature and rainfall. Areas like northeastern China, southeastern Australia, central US will largely be unproductive, too hot, too dry. Sea level will be somewhere between 20 and 40 meters higher. It's hard to guess because of the uncertainties there. And some people have been brave enough to say the maximum carrying capacity of Earth could be about 1 billion people, not 7.5 or 7.6. Now this is all a science, sort of natural science analysis of where the risks are and where we're going. And I think the students are intuitively understanding that pretty quickly. And of course, this young lady needs no introduction in this country, for sure. But she's saying some quite remarkable direct messages to humanity. This is one of my favorites. And this just came from the UN a couple of weeks ago. You've stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. People are suffering, people are dying, entire ecosystems are collapsing. That statement is supported by observations in Australia. Some of our ecosystems, the Great Barrier Reef is basically collapsing in front of our eyes. And we're in the beginning of a mass extinction. Now, I like this one. All you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. So it's remarkable how she has triggered the beginning of, I think, a really strong social movement. And there have been some scholars in the social sciences and humanities that have also echoed these points. One of my favorite books is this one. These are two complex systems scientists who've written a wonderful book called The Systems View of Life. How did we come about from a single-celled organism close to 4 billion years ago? And it's a really interesting narrative. And why are we the way we are? And why should we be much more attuned to other living creatures around us because we share so much with them? Well, the reason is we've developed a society and economy which is breaking some of those bonds with the rest of life. And they make an important statement near the end. Our world today is dominated by a global economic system with disastrous social and environmental impacts. They use the term predatory capitalism. And they know we are the only species on Earth who knowingly destroys its own habitat. No other species in the evolution of Earth has ever done that. We're the first one that's done that. And of course, we've threatened countless others. There are some solutions. I've done a bit of work with Kate Rayworth at Oxford in the UK. And she's got this very nice conceptual diagram of a new economy that's actually quite different. Calls it the donut, where here you have 9 planetary boundaries. Many of you may be familiar with that, developed initially by Johann Rockström, which try to define a Holocene-like state of the Earth system. How far can we push the Earth before we're in trouble? Now we're just going to update that, and almost all the boundaries will now be transgressed in the next version because of what's happened in the last decade. But Kate says we need an economy that delivers health, food, water, gender equality, social equality, resilience, education. And our present economy isn't doing that. At the same time, it's disrupting the Earth system. She has, I think, 7 points, but I just put 3 of them I thought were really important. This economy needs to be built not on linear thinking and discounting the future, but systems thinking, on dynamic complexity. It should deliver equity in human societies by design, not requiring governments to redistribute after the economy is skewed, the equity issue. And the biosphere, it should be regenerative by design. In other words, you don't make money unless you regenerate the biosphere. Right now you don't make money unless you exploit and damage and destroy the biosphere. Just look at what Bolsonaro is doing to the Amazon. It makes sense economically from his point of view. A colleague of mine who often visits ANU is Deepesh Chakrabarty, who's a philosopher, and he boils it down really nicely. He said our society is based on a human-centric approach, but the Anthropocene demands a zoocentric, a life-centric approach. And he has some nice turns of phrase there. He talks about what we need to develop is epochal consciousness. We need to think of the big picture of the long history of Earth, of our evolution, of where we are. And he said, and this relates to universities, unfortunately we're stuck in departmental thinking. And all of us, I think, who've been in universities can relate to that. Only one more slide, and I'm going to give the last word to my Indigenous colleagues from Australia who've been around for 65,000 years, and they pretty much looked after the continent of Australia. It's been really mucked up in 2 centuries of Europeans. But they had a really nice turn of phrase here. We're only here for a short amount of time to do what we've been put here to do, which is to look after country. That's their mantra. We look after country. We're only a tool in the cycle of things. Notice they understood cycles and systems. We go out into the world and help keep the balance of nature. It's a big cycle of living with the land and then eventually going back to it. So I'll end with there, and hopefully we've got something to stop and ponder about where on earth are we actually going in the Anthropocene. So let me stop there, and we'll have some conversation.
Yes.
And we'll I
don't know what you feel, but there's a lot of emotions in such presentations, and I also think that's a part of us being humans, because we have some challenges to face. And thank you, Will, for the presentation. Maybe some of you have heard it, maybe someone has not, but anyway, we are here to discuss it. And I would like Keri Facer to enter the stage.
Shall we perch on these chairs?
Exactly. Maybe it would be good if you can introduce yourself for the ones who have not really known that you're in town now.
Yeah.
And from what point are you looking at this presentation? And then you can move on to have some reflection on what he has said, and also perhaps some questions that we can respond to. So we see where we're going. And I know that you're all eager to pop into this discussion right now, but please, you will have your time on this occasion. So please, Keri, who are you? And
yeah. So thank you for that. That was important. So I'm the new Zennström Professor at the University of Uppsala. I like to introduce myself as the one who came after Kevin. So Kevin is also here. And my background is really in how we learn, what sort of educational institutions or learning practices we can set up to respond to significant change. and that has involved looking at things like how cities learn, how we rethink our schools, our universities. And the other thing that I've spent a lot of time working on in the last 6 years or so is how we think about the future. Because humans are really bad at thinking about the future. I mean, we're really disastrous. And so quite a lot of my work has been around what does it mean that we have the ability to kind of generate ideas about what might be happening, and that then impacts on what we're doing right now. So you can see why I end up with an interest in questions of how we respond to climate change. Because climate change and the fact that we've not responded to it systematically, to me, is a collective mass failure in finding ways to think about futures in ways that allow us to make meaningful actions in the present. I'm also looking at my notes. My note says, "This is terrifying, what do we do?"
That sums it up pretty well.
Yeah. So what I'm also kind of interested in is the question of how we work with those emotions. And actually, Maria is here in the audience, Maria Hala, who has done, I think, some of the best work on thinking about how we deal with the emotions in these situations and what it means to act. And right now, it's interesting because I kind of came into this field with an assumption that behind the forecasting, behind the models, there were a load of really clear recommendations of what we should be doing. And actually, the more I get into this field, the more I realise that the fossil fuel industry has done a really good job at focusing all of our attention on explaining that this is happening and on persuading people that this is happening. And what there is less of is a question of, okay, so now we believe this, what does that then look like? So one of the things I'm interested in is this question really of how we recognise we haven't lived in this future before and how we learn and experiment together. I would like to ask you, in response when people say, this is terrifying, what the hell we do, how do you normally respond to that?
Yeah, it's a really good question because one of the strong criticisms I get is you're depressing people, you're not giving them hope. And my response to that is, it's not my job to give you hope as a natural scientist. My job is to tell you what it is. And you have to create hope, and you create hope by acting. And I think that's true even for natural scientists who are also humans and get depressed by this too. But if you get out and actually start taking action, individually, but more important, I think, collectively, you generate hope. And you can generate tipping points, you can generate change. But you won't do it by sitting there and asking some academic to give you hope.
I mean,
I'm not in the whole business, I'm
Yeah.
terrible. That's my
Because there is a social scientist who talks about this language. He calls it the sort of post-traumatic stress disorder language. You know Tim Morton's work. So he will say, one of the things we do when we have post-traumatic stress disorder is we get flashbacks and we get anxiety. And what we do is we have visions of this thing that's about to happen, and we locate ourselves outside it, as though this thing is coming, but we're still here. And so one of the things that I'm wondering, one of the reasons I tend not to use climate change anymore, but to use a changing climate or living with, is to locate ourselves in it. We're in it. It isn't coming. We're in it right now. So if we start from a position of being in a process, that's a very different thing from saying it's coming, we've got a choice about how we're going to act, because that actually positions people back outside it again in some ways. And so I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think it's a very good point. And what were you just saying there about being embedded in change rather than its coming? Reminds me of a report that a colleague of mine at Macquarie University in Sydney just put out. She's a biologist named Leslie Hughes. And this is a very different report on climate change. All it's called is, this is what climate change looks like. And there are virtually no words. It's just pictures, all from Australia and Australian Antarctic territory. And it's shocking.
And it's pictures of what's happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. And what has happened.
Exactly.
You see an ecosystem that's completely gone, a moss bed in Macquarie Island. You see a completely huge expanse of the Great Barrier Reef dead. You see a wheelbarrow full of dead flying foxes. They dropped dead out of the sky because they couldn't fly fast enough out of the heat. Just a bit of explanation of what you're seeing. But it's really effective. People are shocked, saying, I thought this was something for 2020. Said no. It's happening now.
So if we try so thinking about how we have these conversations, how do we have productive learning conversations about this? So if we're locating, saying what's happening, naming the situation, locating ourselves in it. But I think there's also something about the theory of change that we work with, and the systems thinking that you've talked about more talks about tipping points. But I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you think social tipping points might be, the kind of the flip of the ecological or the environmental tipping points.
That's a good question. I'm not an expert on that, but I do talk to people like Carl Folk and Steve Carpenter and that who work on complex systems from more of a social ecological system. And what they point out a couple of things. One is systems, really strong systems like the neoliberal capitalist system, seems sort of all-powerful, but they erode slowly from underneath in very many different ways. So it's hard to see that happening. So in fact, there's all sorts of little actions which are slowly eroding the resilience of the system. And then what it tends to happen is you get a trigger point of something that triggers a switch in the system. And a good example of that, probably in a bad way, is in the US, where the US political system was thought to be one of the most stable democracies on the planet. But what was happening, it was being eroded underneath from technological change, social inequality, racial inequality. And you start getting bigger variance in the system, which is typical of the system approaching a tipping point. So you go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump in one election. And now the system may very well tip, but in a bad direction. So what they're arguing in a book called, a paper that I'd encourage you to read called Dancing on the Volcano, which I think was published within the last 6 months. Steve Carpenter is the lead author. They're talking about social tipping points and talking about, this sounds like what we really need, but they said beware that you can tip it in a wrong direction too, and that seems to be what's happening in the US. We'll see with the events that are unfolding now. But I think the point is that social tipping points, I think, are even harder to understand and predict than natural science tipping points. But they do occur, and that's actually, in a way, a source of hope.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that the work that I've been doing on futures really encourages us to think about is that the future is not known. It's even when we can produce these sort of maps, that it is a space of openness. And so the question is how do we create novelty? How do we create something new that is not yet known to us? And this is not just technical, magical, wishful thinking. It is simply, how do we create something new to allow some sort of shift to occur? Because we've talked about transformation. I mean, if it's real transformation, it means we don't know what to. It means we're transformation to a completely different sort of world.
Yeah, and that's another point that these social scientists make, is that as social systems begin to destabilize, and you can see multiple tipping points, you've got to be in there and getting ready with an alternative stable state. That can be there, or else you have a real mess.
We've got to learn. There's a brilliant phrase, Milton Friedman actually, who invented neoliberalism. Yeah. God help us. He had a brilliant phrase. He basically said, you have to have good ideas lying around in a crisis.
Yeah,
so, and quite clearly, we are already in conditions of crisis, and so one of the questions that I've been working on, what are the alternative systems that are lying around and latent? They haven't been developed yet, but they are in the process of being made, that allows us to move rapidly to a different sort of social organisation. And critically, this feels to me, it's like the economic models that we're talking about require really radical innovation right now, because neoliberalism ain't doing it for us.
And it won't do it.
It will not do it for us. Which is why some people call it the Capitalocene, isn't it?
Yeah,
rather than the
Anthropocene,
Anthropocene, which I think is worth pulling out. I mean, there are some really radical and interesting city-based experiments that are going on that are fundamentally about thinking about a different economic basis for a city and a different ecological basis for a city. So the Commonwealth programs that there are in Cleveland, I don't know if you've come across that, and in Preston, are really starting to model different experiments. And it feels to me that we have an obligation now to start sharing different experiments, because we can see that, okay, so we can name the problem, now what? What does it look like? How do we start acting? And I'd be really interested in hearing from everybody here what the examples and practices are that we have available. I'm aware that we're just talking. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm just letting you free because I think it's so interesting. So, but maybe you would like to respond to
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert in this, but I'll just give one example of where I think both bottom-up and top-down approaches. But there are a lot of transition town movements.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of city garden communities growing up in Canberra, for example, other places, sure. But then top-down leadership is really important. We don't have that in Australia. We're going the wrong way.
Yeah.
But across the Tasman in New Zealand, there's a revolution occurring with a change of government there and the new Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. And she put in a requirement for any legislation that comes forward to her government and to be evaluated has to have 3 criteria, and they are hierarchical. The first one is this going to improve the well-being of people in New Zealand? The second one, is this going to enhance the environmental integrity of the New Zealand environment? And the third one, does this make sense economically? So she's saying she's going to invert it from the criteria now is this going to deliver more money for the wealthy people and whatever, and then the other things are sort of tack-ons. She says you need to invert this. And so she's trying to generate a well-being society. And it's remarkable about how she's getting movement started.
I think this to me is what we need to be building alongside this narrative, which is those examples and those stories
Yes.
of what's already going on. Because we know, actually from Maria's work as much as anything, if you want to build hope, you need to have a sense not only that you can act and that you can act with others, but that other people that you don't even know are also acting. So there is something about recognising that all around the world, that we are not the only people having this conversation. There are millions of people around the world sitting in rooms like this going, okay, we've got the message now, so what do we do and how do we act? And one of the challenges for us, I think, as a movement, and we are a global movement, is how we network up and how we learn rapidly from each other about what we're doing and how we might act. So here this morning I had a meeting with the city talking about their city planning activities, and there are some astonishingly good proposals in terms of both economics and sustainability. So if we're able to model here one way of doing things, then how does that get out? How does that connect up? Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful to think that that's the hope of it, I guess. Also that people are reacting. I just have one question that I want to raise. Why 1950? Why is that sort of... And I also would like to ask you, many people are now saying that the change will not come without civil resistance. We cannot rely on working within the system to change the system. We have to do something radical about it. And they are also pushing for non-violent alternatives. So I would like to hear your response on that.
I'll quickly give you the 1950s thing. There's a wonderful book written by a historian named John McNeill called Something New Under the Sun. He published it about 10 years ago. That's the best description from the socioeconomics of what happened in the 20th century. But the very quick view of it is a lot of old semi-feudal institutions that came out of Europe in the 1800s, and even North America, the early 1900s with the robber barons and so on. Those got broken, finally smashed by 2 world wars and the Great Depression in between. So that opened up space for new ideas. So you had the Bretton Woods institutions, new institutions like that. And you had a couple of decades of growing equality, of growing economic growth, things were getting better and so on, until the neoliberal system around the 1970s or 80s started taking it off on the trajectory we see now. And in that regard, I think you could read Thomas Piketty's book about how there seem to be these cycles of accumulation of power and wealth in a few hands, disruption, systems break apart, things are equalized, and then the system starts up again. And I think he describes 3 cycles in his book. So those are just 2 books, two ideas that I think can give you some insight of why 1950.
The Piketty book is, it's astonishing. It's really worth a read. I think, speaking as somebody who works in universities, I think universities is a kind of site that needs mobilising, also needs a bit of breaking and then remaking. As Lake and Anderson pointed out to me, the great acceleration graphs that you have, they're also mirrored by the great acceleration in the number of people going to university. So there's a real issue, this notion that education will lead to transformation, is not necessarily the case. I mean, the thing I'm wondering is is, I mean, we've had markets, we've had capitalism for years, and it is neoliberalism, comes in the 1970s, radically increases inequalities. I wonder if what we need to do is to start picking off, separating the supporters, because something like as radical an economic policy as neoliberalism is not sustained and supported by the large majority of people. And the only reason it survives is because sort of those in the middle see themselves as allies to it and not as part of those other people over there. So I wonder if there's some work that we need to do to start understanding how and where markets are not as destructive as they are through neoliberalism, and to pick off different forms of capitalism to stop it being able to shore up this particularly toxic brand. I was just thinking that as you were talking, but we'll see. So does Kate Raworth and any of this work, what are the practical examples? Because the things that I've been looking at for the last few years are around, for example, the growth of the cooperative movement, and whether we actually start seeing cooperatives and local currencies as really kind of old ideas that might be able to play new roles. Are you seeing what else are you seeing in terms of economic?
I haven't looked that deeply into the
Yeah.
economic side, so I really can't speak to that.
Yeah,
Any
okay, there's
authority.
probably people in here who have
We know more about that tonight.
And I also have a question before we let. You didn't answer my question on non-violence series.
Oh, sorry, no, absolutely, non-violence, yes.
But I can hop into another question as well, because now we are talking about the Agenda 2030 as a sort of a door to make the world come together. What do you think about that?
About 2030?
The 2030 SDGs.
The SDGs, yes.
To be honest, I haven't paid much attention to them, and the reason I haven't is because I've seen the MDGs and I've seen all sorts of things like that. Great ideas, get through the bureaucracy, get fragmented, lose systems approach. So you have 17 SDGs and 169 targets or something like that. That's just not manageable. So I think that's unfortunately part of the same system that we can't change, continuing to do things like that. So I think a lot of the intentions are great, but I think the system is in the middle of it, and the UN is in the middle of it.
I have probably a slightly different response, which is I think one of the difficulties that we have now is creating spaces to talk across difference and to talk across the very different responses. There's a whole load of people that will respond to this talk and go, I'm not going to be around, I don't care. I mean, there will. There's a whole load of people who don't respond to this with any sort of feeling of anxiety or concern. They have different worldviews, they have different positions. Their primary concern is how do I go through the next 6 weeks without starving. So there's people with very different responses, and I think any institution that keeps conversation going across difference is hugely important. And we're seeing that with the whole growth of Cambridge Analytica and the way in which our online public spaces are being destroyed and fragmented, and people are being set against each other. So something like the SDGs, I think, in and of themselves will not deliver what we want, but what it still does is create an open space, I think, in my view, for conversation across difference, and we urgently need that. In terms of civil resistance, my hunch is, there's a brilliant phrase, when somebody says, there's a world out there, people have got PhDs, they've got masters in engineering, they've got all of this stuff, and it was a critique of Transition Town, and he said, and they're just there, like, making jams and swapping clothes. And I think there is something to that, actually what do we have in terms of our knowledge and our skills and our institutions? How do we act where we stand? So yes, the non-violent movement and maybe even violent resistance, frankly, once this tipping point starts slipping, once the social tipping point starts slipping, there will be violence. I mean, this is the problem, there will be. This is how states maintain control. So, it really worries me, this business of shifting into a social tipping point. So we need the non-violent resistance. We may also need to take more personal risks than that as well. But at the same time, I would suggest to people, don't just be out on a Friday afternoon and enjoying a demo. What can you do in your institution? How do you get into the kind of lifeblood of where you are? How do you use your existing power? How do you use your existing resources? Everybody in this room has power and capacity where you stand. You've got history and experience. So what I slightly worry about is the idea that we put all of our energy into, if you like, going out onto the streets, rather than actually thinking about where is it that we have the capacity to act, which is why the only thing that I am really qualified to talk about is how I act within universities, because that is the thing that I know and that's what I'm working on. And so my commitment is to work out how we mobilise these enormous institutions that you employ so many people, that spend so much money, that have so much land, that generate so many students. How can I shift their practices? And so my question would be to everybody else, how do we act within the institutions that we're already acting in? Because again, we can feel quite powerless if we think the only thing we can do is influence government or do some recycling. Yeah. There is actually a middle range, you know, there is a middle zone of action.
Yeah. And now we have about 40-45 people here, and all the ones who want to say something or have a question or something, try to be concise. Because then we can allow as many people as we can to talk, and we can have a concise introduction. Yes?
You mentioned Wilkinson.
Yeah.
And Wilkinson shows how